So today we're going to be talking about social structures and hierarchies.
Let's go way back to the beginning. We see the switch from hunting and gathering down to farming and settled civilizations. These civilizations were the first to see social hierarchies. In Babylonia, the top of the social hierarchy included the landowning class, which had priests, the royalties, and the merchants.
And then below them were a class of dependent farmers and artisans. The lowest class were the slaves, obviously, and punishment was worse for the lower class and less brutal for the higher classes.
From 2200 BCE to 250 BCE in China, King Wu formed the first feudal class system. The kinship structures of the Shang and the early Zhao periods, which were based on the clan, gave way to the first three-generation family of grandparents, parents, and children that were the fundamental social unit.
In Assyria, all people were treated the same and had the same rights. The largest class in Assyria were farmers.
Between 1000 BCE to 30 CE, Western Iran's social society was divided between the warriors, the priests, and the farmers/shepherds.
And then in early Rome, the more land that you owned, the higher your status was.
In India, people were born into the caste system. Within the caste, people were placed into the jati. Jati were regional groups within other groups, which people of common occupational spheres married, ate, and generally interacted with other members of their group.
The caste system was
The Brahmins,
which consisted of priests and scholars,
the Kshatriya,
which was warriors and officials,
the Vaishya,
which was merchants, artisans, and landowners,
the Shudra,
peasants and laborers,
and the untouchables.
They were considered to be even less than the lowest class.
Early sub-Saharan Africa had a hunter-gatherer society. Kingdoms were normally divided into social categories by age, gender, occupation, and kinship.
And then the Arabs dominated socially because there were more of them in society.
Byzantine's urban elite class shrank due to a population decrease and a decline in wealth. The manorial system in medieval Europe consisted of nobles and their families at the top, with the lowest class consisting of serfs.
Warriors who could fight on horseback gained land and social status. The feudal system within the manorial system was royals on top, nobles after them, knights below them, and peasants on the bottom. Both the Tang and the Song had hierarchies where the emperor was at the top, the gentry officials were below them, the artisans and the peasants were at the bottom. The Japanese shogunate had the shogun at the top, then the samurai, and then the peasants.
Between the time of 600 and 1500 in Latin America, we see many different social hierarchies. In Teotihuacan, the economy was based on chinampas and an agricultural society. The society was made of a ruler, an elite class, and merchants and peasants.
The Mayans depended on agriculture, and the elite served political and secular roles that were military-based. Merchants and peasants were the bulk of the state.
The Aztecs had a monarchy system. The warrior elite controlled much of the society, and the merchants specialized in long-distance trade. Peasants and laborers, on the other hand, achieved social mobility through battle. The Kaupalai were groups of up to 100 families that made up the social building block. The economy was based on a tribute.
The Chavan had hereditary rulers with hereditary chiefs and aristocracy, and the merchant and peasant class. The Inca were pastoralists with a strong military that were very religious. The royal family were acclaimed descendants of the sun. They had hereditary local leaders and aristocracy, and they followed by merchants and farmers.
Now we're going to talk about the Mongol and the Ming empires between 1200 and 1500. The Mongol Empire had a military elite, and their leaders were called the Khan. Slaves worked in the camps that the Mongols lived in.
The Ming Empire had an emperor, an elite military class, or an aristocracy that participated in the civil service exam. They then had scholars, merchants, and peasants.
The Mali Empire had a hierarchy that included the elites and nobles, the scholars and merchants, and the farmers and peasants.
The Delhi Sultanate, on the other hand, were ruled by sultans. The elite enjoyed luxury and power, the bureaucracy facilitated government, the local rulers kept peace, and the peasants labored.
Like in medieval Europe, the social structure in the Latin West between 1500 and 1200 was based on feudalism.
Maritime exploration, led by mostly European countries, led to a demand for slave labor from Africa to be transported all over the world. These slaves were considered to be subhuman because of white European supremacy.
The economies of these countries changed as they saw what other places had to offer. Now, here's Grace Parsons to report on European society.
Society was dominated by a small number of noble families who enjoyed privileged access to high offices in the church, government, and military. Below them was a large class of commoners that included clergy, bureaucrats, professionals, and military officers, as well as merchants, artisans, and landowners. The lowest class was the vast majority. They were journeymen and rural laborers. There was some social mobility in the middle class. The principal way of social class was the economy, and the second was education.
Good. Thank you, Grace, for that useful information.
The French called the urban class the bourgeoisie. Members of the bourgeoisie devoted long hours to their businesses and poured their profits back into them. The Netherlands are a great example of bourgeoisie enterprise. Dutch manufacturers and craftsmen turn out a variety of goods for their services.
Colonial Spanish America and Brazil, the highest-ranking Spanish officials of the colonies enjoyed broad power. The class below them were the hidalgos, lesser nobles, who were Spanish merchants, artisans, priests, and lawyers. Creoles, some of European descent born in the New World, were the next class in the social hierarchy.
Plantation owners were the leading aristocracy. Then there were a small level of managers and officials, and then of course the slaves were considered subhuman.
The social structure in the Ottoman Empire was based on Sharia law. Artisans and merchants organized themselves into guilds that had strong social and economic bonds.
Between 1500 and 1800, Japan was run by warlords called the daimyo. Each daimyo has a small town and a small bureaucracy and a band of warriors, the samurai. The Ming Empire followed the Confucian
The City
social
Council with more information on the early Industrial Revolution.
During the early Industrial Revolution, there was a big gap between the rich and the poor. Owners of the factories moved up the social hierarchy because of all the wealth that they had acquired. After the industrialization of Britain, the gap widened between the rich and the poor. There was still a basic social hierarchy.
By the end of the 19th century, slavery was abolished and a basic social hierarchy was formed.
Under the Tanzimat, non-Muslims were treated equally and they were brought up under the classist structure.
Russia was dominated by nobles whose estates were worked on by serfs, and they had almost no middle class under Alexander II since he emancipated the serfs in 1861.
Under Alexander's rule, Russia gained more artistic, intellectual, and professional people for the urban middle class. China had an increasing population of homeless and unemployed people.
Time to discuss Africa and India under the British Empire between 1750 and 1870.
In Egypt, under Muhammad Ali, a new class of educated Egyptians emerged and there were hard demands on peasants for labor and military service.
In India, the East India Company took over the rule from the emperor. Indians were now below the Europeans and within the Indian people. The Indian caste system remained the same.
In Australia and New Zealand, Britain colonized them and white people had more say and were above the indigenous people in the class system.
White people. In English-speaking countries between 1850 and 1900, the working class grew incredibly. Japan had a rigid Tokugawa class system, and as you can see here, the emperor was at the top of the social hierarchy, but he didn't really have any real power, kind of like the Queen of England. The shogun was the real ruler of Japan. The daimyo were the wealthy landowners, and the shogun were below the emperor on the social hierarchy. The samurai were below them, the peasants were below them, and the merchants were the lowest class.
In Russia, the Tsar Alexander II emancipated the slaves in 1861. Wealthy landowners and aristocrats dominated the government and blocked most reforms, while the middle class had almost no influence.
Between 1869 and 1914, Europe and North America wanted to abolish slavery in Africa, but they divided people into races based on physical appearance. Whites were always at the top, and the people below them were considered uncivilized, semi-barbarous, barbarian, and savage.
Colonies had white settlers above indigenous people, disregarding the fact that the white settlers were usually the minority of the group.
In Egypt, the elite class consisted of landowners and merchants, while the peasants had to pay heavy taxes. In the Congo Free State, the indigenous people were forced to collect rubber.
Some places in Africa were kingdoms with aristocracies, and some had commercial towns with a dominant merchant class. Others were agricultural based, some were pastoral or hunters and gatherers.
European countries tried to return to the hierarchical ways of the pre-war era, but they couldn't.
During the 1920s, the Soviet Union recovered from the revolutions of 1917 and the Civil War that followed.
After Stalin achieved total mastery of this huge nation in 1929, he led it through an economic and social transformation, and that turned it into a great industrial and military power, and intensified both admiration for and fear of communism throughout the world.
Technological advances widened the gap between African, Asian, and Latin American social classes. Political life revolved around the desire of the elites for political independence, while ordinary people yearned for social justice.
The Soviet Union and the United States established competing military alliances. Each side portrayed tension as a struggle between irreconcilably different social and economic systems,
which eventually led to the launching of the Sputnik in the race for space.
This is such a bad idea. You guys, I did terrible in the reverse part of my parking thing.